Hello, my name's Stephen Elliman. I'm the head of research at Orbsen Therapeutics. Orbsen Therapeutics was spun out of the Regenerative Medicine Institute based here at NUI Galway, and Orbsen is focused on developing next generation defined cell therapies for diseases with unmet need. So mesenchymal stromal cells are cells that live within multiple tissues. Primarily we focus on the bone marrow. And we can take those cells, explant them from the marrow and grow them up in a dish. The nice thing about mesenchymal stromal cells or stromal cells is that we can take 50,000 cells and expand them to like 100 million cells, which would correspond to a clinical dose. We can take that 100 million cells, inject them into a patient IV, and these cells have rather remarkable immunomodulating capacities. And by that I mean they can reduce inflammatory responses in diseases such as graft versus host disease, acute lung injury and so on. So they're a very nice somatic stromal cell that is ethically non-contentious. It's safe. These cells have been given to over 3,000 people around the world in over 100 clinical trials, and we're beginning to see quite nice and robust clinical efficacy in late-stage trials coming from trials with these products.
Okay.
So Orbsen Therapeutics' mandate is to develop next generation stromal cell therapies for diseases with unmet need. At the moment, stromal cell or MSC therapies are currently being developed for rare diseases with very difficult outcomes. And these include critical limb ischemia, acute lung injuries, and these rare diseases require a low regulatory threshold. So these people have no options, therefore cell therapies are their final option. Regulators are asking developers that want to give these therapies to broader diseases to meet higher regulatory thresholds. So one of those thresholds is to define the drug, if you like, better. So what we've done here at Orbsen Therapeutics is we've taken the stromal cell therapy paradigm, we're beginning to treat it like a drug. So we're defining the drug, we're describing exactly what the drug is and the mechanism of action. And for broader use of these cell therapies, this is going to be essential in the future. So Orbsen are similar to a company in Australia called Mesoblast. Mesoblast are really leading the way in defined stromal cell therapies. So much like Mesoblast have a marker called STRO3 that allows them to isolate cells specifically from certain tissues, we have identified a marker called ORB1 that we've codified that allows us to prospectively isolate and define stromal cells from multiple tissues. So we believe that puts us sort of at the forefront of this stromal cell therapy field that allows us to use a defined product that we can map throughout the developmental path and the regulatory path as we take this therapy forward. The nice thing about that is when you have a defined and regulatory approved product, the regulators are going to be able to use that in a broader context or approve it in a broader context. So diseases such as osteoarthritis, where you have many more patients, rheumatoid arthritis, when you want to apply this therapy to these broader diseases, it will allow for a simpler regulatory path. Well, the difference between a company approach to developing a cell therapy and an academic approach is that the academic approach is very focused on that academic investigators' academic interests. For example, a certain investigator will be interested in arthritis or critical limb ischemia, and they will follow the development of that therapy. That is their career path, that's their interest, they want to develop a therapy for that clinical interest. Where a company comes in is we tend to put in very early go, no-go stages in the development of a therapeutic product. So we will take a very unbiased approach to where the cell therapy will work. For example, within the Red Star program that we currently have funded with NUI Galway and here at Orbsen, we're looking at 6 independent tissue complications within the disease diabetes. We're looking at neuropathy, cardiomyopathy, wound healing, bone fracture, and so on. We're taking a very unbiased approach, and we're going to be applying our cell therapy across 6 different disease indications. And we'll take an unbiased approach when we assess to see where this cell therapy is specifically useful. It may well be that the cell works very well in all 6 complications, therefore that's very interesting. but it may also be that the cells only work in 2 out of the 4. And that, by using that unbiased approach, we'll be working or progressing the cell specifically in an area where we know that the cells will work in a disease model. So whereas we take an unbiased approach to developing the cell therapy, an academic investigator, if, for example, the stromal cell therapy doesn't work in diabetic nephropathy, they will move on to another therapy for diabetic nephropathy, whereas we're focused on developing the drug for the best indication that it's suitable for. Cell therapy in Europe is regulated by the European Medicines Agency, and the EMA laid down several directives and guidelines regulating the use of cell therapy. Up until about 2007, those regulations were quite broad and were related to safety of the therapy and toxicity of the therapy. More recently, the regulations in 2009 stipulated certain guidelines that cell therapies in the future would have to be defined in the same manner as any drug that you would take from ibuprofen to statins. So we were aware of these guidelines coming down the path, and they actually influenced and helped design the Orb1 product. Specifically, cell therapies typically are not defined, they're not prospectively isolated. They're a heterogeneous product that we have good mechanism of action for, we have good efficacy for, but we don't really know how the cell therapy works. So the regulations or the guidelines of late from the European Medicines Agency, specifically the Committee for Advanced Therapeutics, stipulated that we'll have to identify the cell therapy, purify it, and show a mechanism of action. So within Orbsen, we've kind of taken those guidelines to heart, and they kind of drove us to develop a tool to isolate, prospectively identify and define our cell therapy, and then using the same marker to identify good donors for the cell therapy and identify, we're using like sort of the Orb1 protein, specifically as a potency assay to identify cells that give us good efficacy, and we understand, enable us to understand the mechanism of action. So within Orbsen's within Orbsen itself, the regulations actually and guidelines drove or led to the development of our product. So we're hoping to be the first European cell therapy developer that is in line with new directives and regulations as they come out of the EMA. The nice thing about cell therapy research is we're finding out new paradigms and new parts of the biology every day. The nice thing is we come in, we find out there's new data published every day. Sometimes you think you're following the right path and a paper can be published that will lead you down to a different direction. So the nicest thing about this work is, one, getting new data every day. We have a productive team here at Orbsen. We get good new data every week, which is excellent. And it's such a dynamic field. It's now reaching a crest, whereas 20 years ago the field was quite slow and there weren't a lot of people working on stromal cell therapies. Now there's a specific critical mass. There's a good 6 or 7 companies commercializing cell therapies in this space, so it's competitive, and it really will benefit the patient in the long run if you have half a dozen companies all vying to develop the most optimal stromal cell therapy for the patients. It's a challenging space. For example, from an Orbsen perspective, we're probably the smaller end of the SMEs developing cell therapies, so we have a significant challenge ahead to catch up to some of the more established players. But I find that kind of challenging. We're lucky in that we have a cutting edge technology that allows us to compete in this space. So it's hard work, it's challenging, but it's like being at school for the first time every day. It's a very exciting field to be in.